Hello and welcome. My name is Forrest Longman, and I am the current president of City Club. The mission of City Club is to inform, connect, and engage our community to strengthen the civic health of our region. We emphasize civil conversations and listening to others. Please watch your email and our website for details about our July program. And as always, I'd like to thank all the volunteers who make our programs possible. I'd also like to thank KMRE radio board member Robert Clark, who's producing today's program, and BTV10, who will be broadcasting it to their viewers. I'd also like to thank our business sponsors for their support. They are Larson Gross, Danny Neal of the Mulyat Group, Pacific Continental Realty, Village Books, Whatcom Community College, Lummi Commercial Company, the Opportunity Council, Unity Care Northwest, Western Washington University, Whatcom Community Foundation, and Bruce and Claudia Deasand. Finally, I'd like to turn things over to Tim Douglas, who will introduce our speaker and moderate today's program.
Thanks very much, Forrest. We're really honored today to have a distinguished guest, Ambassador James F. Collins. He has a distinguished career as a diplomat and has been a close observer of all things happening in terms of the evolution of U.S. foreign policy. James was educated at Harvard and Indiana University. Yay, Indiana. I was fortunate to go there too, Jim. He was the ambassador to the Russian Federation from 1997 to 2001, which included Vladimir Putin's first year as president. He's also served in other posts, including holding positions at the U.S. consulate in Izmir, Turkey, and also the U.S. Embassy in Amman, Jordan. He's been a special advisor to the State Department, particularly on the former Soviet Union's successor states. But he is knowledgeable about so many parts of the world and so many things that have happened in the past and continue to evolve as we speak. He has won some very distinguished awards in the State Department itself, including a distinguished career service. So he is obviously recognized by many as a person who really understands what's happening in the world. And he's told me he doesn't try to read crystal balls, but we may sort of entice him to do some prognostications anyway. At any rate, Ambassador Collins, it's our honor and delight to have you here, and I want to welcome you to Bellingham.
Well, Tim, thank you very much, and thank you very much to the City Club. It's a real pleasure to speak with an audience outside Washington, frankly. I think a successful international policy and foreign policy for our country really depends on the support and consensus of the American people about, one, what we're about, what are our values, what are our interests, and how do we expect to play a role in the world that has the support of the American people and serves their interests and their long-term well-being. And I think, frankly, for the last 2 decades, probably, we've been in search of a new one, a new consensus. Because the old one that I lived with and was part of for my career, the Cold War and its end, really has, I think, disappeared from the scene. And the world is a very different place from what I knew as a bipolar international system, and has become now a multipolar or a international system depending on several great powers and a great deal of action by things other than sovereign states. So there's a lot to learn and a lot to change that's going to be required if we're going to have an effective foreign policy. And I think we haven't quite arrived at that point yet.
Well, that's why we've got you here, and we're eager to hear your observations along the way about this and many matters. In fact, your coming to Bellingham today is so timely because we have just completed Biden's his visit to Europe and his talk with Vladimir Putin, Russian president. So why don't you start by telling us a little bit about your take on that particular set of events and what it means for our foreign policy?
Well, I think, as I mentioned, one of the great challenges in front of our leadership as a nation today is the fact that we are divided in many ways. And the world in which there was a consensus about the order and Americans sort of understood our position in a global system has really been, in a sense, torn apart and brought to upheaval by the end of the Cold War, the rise of China and Asia as new economic powers, the relative change in America's capacity to be the dispositive country in the international system, and our own uncertainty about exactly where America is going to fit now. How does it fit into this system? And I think that's the challenge. Now, what I think Mr. Biden has done is to try to articulate in this trip, in a sense, a new kind of idea about what America is going to try to be in the new international order and how we can play a leading role in that order that will be effective. His predecessor, Mr. Trump, basically took the view that the way to do it was to be America first. America basically pursue only its own interests. Others would be, I suppose, become our allies or our friends or our adversaries, depending on whether or not it made America greater. I think Mr. Biden is trying to suggest that we have a different approach, that our consensus is going to have to be based on two or three things. First, that any foreign policy and international understanding of what we're trying to do is going to have to serve the interests of the American middle class and our population. Second, it's going to have to be based on the values that are fundamentally what define America. Our democracy, our respect for human rights, our respect for the individual's right to freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and so forth. That it has to be value-based in part. Third, that it has to meet also the interests of our nation, our national security interests, that our safety is advanced and promoted. And finally, it has to, I think, address those issues effectively that are beyond the capacity of any one country to deal with, such as climate. So when he went to Europe, it seemed to me he laid down the idea that our strength in many ways in the international system will be based on our capacity to have solid and good relations with countries like us or who have values and interests that we share. And the shorthand word here was democracies, but fundamentally, it is those nations that I would say share our basic value structure and our basic ideas about what a just society ought to entail. Secondly, I think he demonstrated that, I think, in his meetings with our allies, in NATO, in the G7, and in the European Union. Secondly, I think in the meeting with Mr. Putin, he made clear something else. And that is that we are going to have nations with whom we disagree about a great number of things and where we do not come together. He was prepared to call Mr. Putin's Russia a worthy adversary. In many ways, I think it's absolutely true. We are going to have an adversarial relationship with Russia and it seems with China as well. But he said something beyond that, and that was that it is in our interests, our mutual interests, both with allies and as adversaries, to manage our differences effectively so that we do not end up in open hostility and we do not end up endangering the security and lives of our peoples. And that's true for both of us. So to the extent we as nations, as superpowers in the nuclear sense, have created the capacity to destroy each other and probably the rest of the world, we have a responsibility and indeed a fundamental interest in ensuring that that kind of catastrophe never happens. So we have to manage our adversarial relationship. And he also said that there are those areas in which we will agree, that we have shared interests and shared goals. And he talked about climate, and he raised things, areas such as strategic stability, which means basically managing our nuclear capacities. But he also introduced something new. He introduced the idea that we have to find common ground in how we're going to approach some of the new technologies that are defining our societies, in particular cyber issues. And so I think, he, in this sense, was trying to help along the process of reaching a new idea about what is American foreign policy, what will be its fundamental elements, and talk with our allies and friends and our adversary, probably our principal adversary, about exactly how we hope to pursue our interests and our policies with each of those groupings. And he's, I think, trying to bring Americans along to understand that and to support that kind of policy. The question that's open is, can he do it? And will America get behind this idea that, it is not so much to defeat Russia, but rather to manage our differences? That is probably the critical issue.
That's a very interesting and I think apt summary of things. I'm curious from what you hear, and particularly from what you hear amongst colleagues and other things as you observe them, do you think the rest of the world is still a bit baffled by America at this point? I mean, you've raised the point that we need to be, we need to have our own position consolidated internally, but what do others think about us right now?
Well, I, like everybody else, I've been under house arrest for about 1.5 years, so I don't pretend to be someone who's had a lot of contact with people in the outside world, much less even here in Washington, much less in Europe and so on. But I think it probably is true that as the consensus that held us all together, our allies and so forth, during the Cold War, and I would say even through the 90s, has come apart simply because the entire Cold War framework of the world has disappeared. We are in a position where our allies and our friends are not too sure exactly about how far the United States has come to terms with new realities and has a coherent and clear direction. Now, I think they welcomed Mr. Biden after 4 years of a leadership in which they, frankly, were unsure that America was going to stand by its alliances. We're unsure that all of the sort of, I would say, economic and socioeconomic connections that had built the relationship of the last half of the 20th century were not uncertain. I think they want to believe that Mr. Biden can pull this through, but I think there is doubt about how much the American idea or the American definition of its future and its policy toward its allies and adversaries is actually decided. Or will we have another big change, with a new president if we have one in 3 years? So I think there is caution. There's a bit of uncertainty about just what is America going to stand for, and how is it going to treat its allies? How is it going to treat its adversaries? What are its goals? What are its values at the moment?
Ambassador, how would you, just taking that a bit further, looking at the global situation, there clearly is tension between authoritarian countries slash leaders and our own and democracies. Where do you think all of that might be going? Who's going to emerge? I don't want to say victorious, but successfully from that tension.
Well, I think one has to decide what one means by success. Once again, I mean, most nations, most sovereign nations, and certainly I think the United States, does look at a successful set of relations with the rest of the world if it, first of all, protects our values and our way of life and advances our welfare and so forth. And I think, that's very basic. I think it's also true that, at least under this administration, and I would argue I would agree with it, that in a world in which we have other major powers who have a very different view about the way they should govern themselves and how they relate to their populations and so forth, that we cannot take for granted that our values or our approach to governance and to our citizens is going to be shared or even welcomed by other leaders. So we're going to have a world in which I think we have, a division between states that do believe essentially that government should be responsible to the consent of the governed and to the capacity of the governed to have a say in how they are ruled, and those who believe that that role belongs either to a party or to an individual or to a bloodline or something that essentially treats their citizens as subjects. Now, the question really is then, what is a successful set of policies? Well, I would say it has to have two or three ingredients. One, it has to protect the institutions and values and procedures and political systems and so forth of the kinds of democracies that we believe are essential to a good life. And I think we share that kind of vision about what a nation should be with many allies, not only in Europe, but also in Asia and in Latin America and many other places. So there is this community of people who believe that, in fact, the openness of society in one way or another, based on fundamental values that I think we share with them, is going to be what they seek to produce. At the same time, there's no question that there are going to be major groups of states that do not share this and are going to be autocracies in one way or another, or authoritarian governments. I think there is little one can do about those nations unless their populations decide that they no longer are willing to support that form of government. Now, I say that with great humility because it's not easy in an authoritarian regime to live and say, I no longer support you. But the reality is it does happen. It has happened in the past. Governments have changed, and we have had significant changes of system over the past half century that show that nothing is completely static. So I think the critical point for us is that we must manage our adversarial relations such that they do not produce either physical danger to our citizens or danger and challenge that is disruptive of our economic, socio-political systems and welfare. But at the same time, we have to ensure that we don't have, to the extent we can do it, resort to force or war, and certainly not to challenge each other in ways that could provoke catastrophe. Now, I think that means we manage relations with both allies and adversaries, and that is going to have to be the basis of a um, successful policy. The one thing that I think is a problem for Americans to come to terms with is this idea that, in a sense, it's our business to try to change our adversaries, to get them in one way or another to conduct themselves at home and abroad in ways that are compatible with our view of what's right and what's acceptable. We haven't been terribly successful at that. Now, we had great success in World War II when we defeated both the Nazi regime and the Japanese, and they basically surrendered. And the idea was, gave us unconditional surrender, said, you won, and we are going to now be guided by you in terms of our future. Well, that may not be the only model. And I would say to have that as the idea of the only thing that is success is going to be a source of constantly frustrated efforts to pursue a policy. Because we haven't had a military victory since World War II. We've had outcomes, but in essence, we have basically ended up with almost all disputes, even those that went into a situation of open conflict, ending in something less than the World War II unconditional surrender, and produced basically an outcome negotiated and arrived at by everybody sort of saying enough is enough and we'll live with what we have. Now, that's not necessarily very acceptable to Americans, but I think it is something we need to keep in mind.
You mentioned disruption, and certainly there's so much disruptive activity now, or certainly many people see it as disruptive. You had a very interesting experience of your own. You happened to be the acting ambassador to Russia when there was an unsuccessful coup that resulted eventually pretty quickly in the collapse of the former Soviet Union. And then recently here, we've had an assault on our own capital. Can you say anything about those two events and make any comparisons or contrasts in what actually happened? And maybe tell us a little bit about that Russian experience. It has some sort of interesting anecdotal aspects to it, the babushki thing.
Well, yeah, I mean, first of all, I would say that it's sort of apples and oranges. I mean, it really was a very different experience in the Russian case and in the case of what we've had here in Washington. But there were certain things that I suppose one ought to keep in mind as a framework. But in the Russian case, I would say, first of all, that you had the effort to stop the kind of change that President Gorbachev had been carrying through in Russia and in the Soviet Union for his term of about 4+ years. And all of that, in essence, had in many ways opened up the Soviet system, had liberalized many elements of it. I remember going back for the first time in about 20 years and walking down a street and seeing that the first thing I had confronted on a street that had been, sort of the hallmark of the Soviet system was a group of Hare Krishna people dancing down the street. Well, that could no more have been thought about in the 1960s or 70s than flying to the moon was at that time. But I think the reality was that that coup was an effort by the old line, I would say, people who were trying to hold the old system together, to stop what they saw as its gradual disintegration and transition into something that they felt was a threat both to them and to the order that they had all given their lives to defend. And what was interesting about the coup was, I think, the organizers really thought they were going to do exactly what they had done to Mr. Khrushchev in the mid-50s when the leadership got together, said Mr. Khrushchev is not capable of ruling anymore, and he was removed from office. Well, I mean, they got together this time, did the same thing. And first of all, Mr. Gorbachev didn't resign. And secondly, others, most particularly Mr. Yeltsin, stood up and say, wait a minute, you can't be taking this step. You're not entitled to do it. So they simply refused to accept the idea that the new group was legitimate. In 2-3 days, the new group, the coup, the people mounting the coup tried to assert their authority. And frankly, just nobody paid any attention. There were all kinds of reasons that happened, but fundamentally, the attempt to use the Russian military against its own population was not something that was going to be successful, and that was pretty clear. I personally said, in a sense, that the coup ended because there was nobody really interested in having it succeed. To put another way, the Soviet Union kind of came to a close because nobody was really interested in defending it. And there were all kinds of, elements at work here. The nationalities in the Soviet Union were trying to assert greater control over their own territories: Ukraine, Armenia, the Baltic states. The public was dissatisfied because the system wasn't even providing enough food at this time. And so in many ways, I think it was fair to say the Soviet Union was canceled for lack of interest. I mean, there just wasn't anybody ready to define its role as having to continue. And they were quite prepared to try something new. And what they tried was no longer an empire. In fact, most of the people in the Russian Federation felt that they had been subsidizing all of these other people forever, and it was time to have Russia enjoy its own wealth, etc. So, I mean, I think the point was that the disintegration of the Union as a political entity, of the end of empire, the end of the communist system, which couldn't produce the economic benefits that its people needed, and the end of the rule of the Communist Party, which had demonstrated it really wasn't that capable of running an effective country, really simply brought the whole enterprise to a conclusion. Well, nobody expected it, frankly. No, the Russians were as surprised as anybody else. But I mean, when it happened very quickly, and it happened essentially because people wanted to try something new. Now, I think if you then try to say, okay, well, what about our January 6th? I would say the exact opposite happened. There was no consensus in the American public that we wanted to try something new or to have a different system brought about by a group of people who had a different idea. We had an election. The vast majority of people accepted that it was a legitimate election. We were going to have a new president. And yes, there were a group of people who tried to assert that it had not been correct, it had been fraudulent, and so on and so on. But basically, there was no real support for that position from the broad public. or the institutions or those with authority. This was simply not accepted. And our institutions had really all basically defined the future as one which was the peaceful transition of power to a duly elected president. And people were willing to accept that. Now, that we still have elements of a population and so forth that have questions or who don't accept it. And a former president who continues to talk about the fact that he was denied a fair election. This is a challenge. But I think the difference is quite remarkable in the sense, it's a very different set of conditions. I don't see our public yearning for an end to our system in preference of something new, let's say, as offered by, I don't know, Xi Jinping. I mean, I don't think that this is the idea. So, I mean, it's a very different kind of situation in many ways. Now, that doesn't mean we don't have some very serious divisions at home about what is the future going to look like. But I think we're trying to come to terms with that ourselves. And, the president President Biden has tried to lay out some thoughts about how he wants it to emerge. We'll see how it does.
Thank you for those observations. Christine Perkins, I just want to, our Whatcom Library Director, Christine Perkins, is keeping an eye on questions from the audience as we go along. So I just want to make sure, Christine, that the door is open if you have anything that you think should be posed to our speaker at this time.
Well, since we're on the topic of Russia specifically, let me just pose a question. One, we have a curious audience member wanting to know if you've read Gorbachev's autobiography, and also what your take is on the G7's involvement in his removal from office and installation of Yeltsin, or the assumption of power by Yeltsin.
Well, I've read parts of the biography, but frankly, my own sense for Mr. Gorbachev is from having known him pretty well and having great respect for many of the things that he did and what he was trying to do. I think, sorry, what was the other part of the question?
Just really the G7's involvement.
Oh. Well, I think my own view of having been part of the conditions in which Mr. Gorbachev's efforts basically came to their conclusion and they were replaced by a different system is that this was, without any question, a function of the decision-making of many, many different elements of the Russian Federation and the Soviet Union itself. It was not something that any outsider made happen, or for that matter, had all that much to influence over. Remember that Mr. Gorbachev was in the process of trying to restructure the Soviet Union himself. He was trying to institute a new constitutional order, which was going in many ways to revise the structure of the Union as a unitary empire, highly centralized, and give much more authority to the constituent republics of Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, so forth. And the coup took place at the time that was about to either become the future or was going to be rejected. And the hardliners basically tried to keep the old centralized system in place. But the idea that the Americans or the Europeans or the G7 or anybody else really were the drivers and the deciders about the fate of the Soviet Union, I think simply is a misreading of history and the way things actually happened. I think, if anything, it's very instructive to read the speech that President Bush gave in Kiev in July of 1991. And the thrust of that speech was that I would say that there was every reason for the republics and for the groups in the republics who were pressing Moscow to grant greater autonomy and greater freedom to each of the republics to be careful and go slowly, not to try to bring about a violent end to the Soviet Union and so on. So the idea that we were anxiously pushing the end of the Soviet Union, I think, is probably totally misplaced. What we wanted was a Soviet Union that could be a compatible partner in shaping the future of a secure Europe. And remember, the motto of the Bush administration at the end of its time, as new Europe was emerging, was a Europe whole, free, and at peace. That was the idea. But I think it's a very big misreading of history to assume that the outsiders were the ones that brought the Soviet Union to an end. It was really the Soviet people themselves that did it. And as I said, in my view, it collapsed more than anything because there were basically no real forces interested in defending it.
Follow-up more recently is the removal of Mr. Yanukovych in Ukraine in 2014. Would you say the same holds true for that? Was that directed or behind the scenes from outside forces, or was that primarily people in the Ukraine and working on that?
Well, I mean, first of all, Ukraine's circumstances are just a tragedy. And I think it has been and was and is and remains and should be America's position that each of the new states that came out of the Soviet Union, and there were 15 of them, including Russia, because all of them had new borders and so forth, were entitled to their sovereignty and their territorial integrity and their own form of government. And the fact that the Russian Federation, in the turmoil and some of the challenges that arose surrounding Mr. Yanukovych's presidency and its end, chose to become involved and, in fact, mount an invasion, was, I think, criminal, and it was a terrible mistake. And it was a tragedy for the Ukrainian nation itself. Now, that said, the idea that the only ones responsible for all this were somehow the West and so on is, I think, again, misplaced. Fundamentally, the failure of the government of Mr. Yanukovych was based in part on its inability to manage the relations with Russia and the West successfully. And it managed its own countries. You know, it had promised it was going to be joining the association with the European Union, not a member, but it was going to be an associate member. Then, and the people of Ukraine had been asked to support that, and we're told that's what's coming. Then the position was absolutely reversed, and they were not going to do that. And essentially, Mr. Yanukovych, I fear, suffered the result of having divided his people even further than they had been divided before, and bringing about, in many ways, his own downfall. as a result of the inability to manage the relations with West and Russia and internally in a way that would prevent the division that ultimately took place. But I would also have to say that Ukraine's problems and current circumstances are very much a function of their inability to solve the problems of their relations with Russia, and Russia's willingness to use force to try to impose their own views about what the relations with Ukraine should be. And I don't think that's something we are ever going to support.
You know, nuclear armament has certainly been historically a real challenging thing, and in a way a balance point too, between the U.S. and the West and the former Soviet Union. Can you speak to nuclear arms and the current situation around their production, their reduction, etc., and not just Russia, U.S., but even globally?
Well, the first and most obvious point, I guess, to make is that the United States and Russia possess about 90% of the world's nuclear weapons. So when you ask about the others, it is, I think, a real issue and challenge to the global system that we have had the proliferation of nuclear weapons to a number of other countries. But there's also no question about who the two nuclear superpowers remain. It's the United States and the Russian Federation. Now, I think it is certainly the case that for the last decades of the Cold War, one of the great successes in Soviet-American relations was the development and building of a structure of treaties, agreements, programs that both reduced the numbers of nuclear weapons dramatically, that also, however, provided for confidence on both sides that each knew what the other was doing and what was going on. So we had a variety of treaties, from open skies, so-called, where we could fly over each other's territory, to other kinds of inspection regimes with these nuclear treaties that gave each side a degree of confidence that we knew what the other was up to and there weren't going to be any surprises. So predictability and transparency was a big part of maintaining a balance and a stable situation in which we could manage the two countries' arsenals and have relative confidence that we wouldn't have a mistake, because a mistake could be catastrophe. Now, in the last 30 years or so, we've had one success, I would say. Well, more than one success. We had a further reduction just in the number of nuclear weapons. Without question, that was important. We also prevented, when the Soviet Union broke up, the appearance of three new nuclear powers in Europe. Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and Belarus all had nuclear weapons, and agreements reached in the 90s essentially removed those weapons from those countries and ensured that in Eurasia, Russia was the only nuclear power. Now, since the 90s, however, I would say we have had combinations of new technologies, our withdrawal and the Russian withdrawal, either de facto or in juridically, from treaties and some of these arrangements that have made the nuclear picture much less certain and much more a matter of concern to both sides, as well as to the global community. And so today, when you've had this summit in Geneva, I think one of the major and most important points that come out of it was the American-Russian seeming agreement. We'll see how it plays out, but seeming agreement to re-engage on trying to define a future nuclear stability, so it's called strategic stability, that would return a greater degree of confidence and insurance that we have the nuclear question under control between the two of us. Now, the problem we face is that there are in the past 20 years, or 30 years, all kinds of new technologies that are making this more and more complicated, including the appearance of cyber capabilities. That is, the whole question of are your communications that control the nuclear weaponry secure? Or could somebody get in and hack it? All of these questions are now on the table. And I think the one constructive thing, perhaps the most interesting and constructive thing to me from Geneva was the idea that we are now, as Russia and the United States, going to see what we can do to talk about these things and see what can be done. It's going to be a particularly important question. But I mean, I think there is no question that in many ways we live in a less secure world from the standpoint of nuclear weaponry or weapons of mass destruction today than we did 30 years ago. And I think it is absolutely essential that we find ways to begin to rebuild the kind of confidence among all nuclear powers sooner or later that nuclear weapons can never be used. It's that simple. And we're a long way from that. It's going to have to be a principal objective. And I think Mr. Biden understands that and supports that fully.
What do you see any shifts taking place? It was just a few years ago that the amount of trade that crossed the Pacific exceeded that crossing the Atlantic. How do you see things now in terms of there's been raised, even during the Biden's time in Europe, they talked more about China as a concern. What do you think's happening in terms of where power and energy is shifting in the world right now? Is it shifting?
Well, it has certainly shifted in certain respects. I mean, there's no question. I saw a chart, not too long ago that talked about, and this was, I think, at the beginning of the mid-90s, when it listed, over decades, the number of trillion-dollar economies. And for a long time, America's was the only one. And then by the 90s, there were half a dozen, and Lord knows how many there are now. And so it simply means that there are many other countries in the world, particularly in the global economic system and a globalized trading and financial system, that are players of, if not the same caliber and size as the United States. If they work together as a couple or three together, they would be. And in the case of China, they are going to be, if not the same as the United States in the economy, then probably have a bigger economy before too long. Now, this means that we have a different global economic context within which we have to work. And I think it's vital that the United States begin to think about how America fits in when it is no longer the kind of economy in terms of its capacity to dominate the economic system of the globe that it was at the end of World War II, and now is one of many big major economies, maybe the biggest, but is probably no longer able to be dispositive about much of anything without agreement from many others involved. So the other thing that to me is intriguing is that the COVID pandemic brought to the fore something that no one had been, it seems to me, had been willing to discuss for a long time. And that was the question of whether or not the whole idea of free trade is, really lifting all boats in the same way, or in a way that ensures that the United States is better off if we have just free trade. When we found out that many elements of the very minimal things we needed to fight the COVID pandemic had to be imported from somewhere else and we couldn't do it, it was a shock. And it raised the question about, well, what is it that we as a nation really have to build or produce at home to ensure that we can deal with things like a pandemic? Free trade had not provided that security, to put it in a most simple way. And so the question that's in front of us now is, well, what does that mean? And I think, Mr. Biden's programs are the questions he's raising about infrastructure, having new support for research and development, having new, I would say, it seems, rules of some kind that would ensure that the United States can produce the essentials it needs for its safety, security, and stability of its population. Are raising new issues, raising new questions for which very few people have any answer. But they do not seem to be answered and have not been answered by, in my view, by the sense free trade, sort of unlimited, unregulated capitalist idea of the last 40 or 50 years that have guided our policies and brought great, wealth and great benefits to the country. But they have also come at costs. So the question, I think, is out in front of us, about how are we going to compete and be secure in a world in which you have needs that may not be easily resolved simply by free trade. And then we're going to have the question about, well, what are the rules of the road in a world in which the economies are linked? We have one information space. We have one almost data space. We increasingly have a globalized trading system. I mean, the container ship has revolutionized the way in which goods move. No one has really been thinking for quite some time, it seems to me, about how the nation state, or a nation like the United States, defines itself and its self-interest in such a world. Mr. Trump tried to do it with new tariffs and controlling trade. I don't think that worked terribly well. Mr. Biden, I think, is trying it by saying we can compete more effectively and so forth if we make the right investments, and that the public is going to have a say in what those investments are. We'll see. But I think the reality is the United States now does have to compete and does not have an immense advantage in many, many ways in the face of competition from some of our most important competitors. And it certainly is true that, the volume and I would say, quantity of trade has certainly shifted to the Pacific. If you look at where the container ships are stacked up trying to get unloaded, it's in Los Angeles, basically. And that's because all that stuff is coming from Asia, Japan, China, Korea, and so forth. So, I think, there is no question that that's the case. However, the EU and the American economies are tremendous engines of economy. They dwarf China together, if taken together. And I think everybody needs to remember that.
Speaking of, potential competition, but also cooperation, let's turn, if we can, for a moment to the existential crisis of climate change. I mean, people here in our immediate area, our state, the West Coast, and I'm sure many others, are really concerned about the urgency of tackling climate change. Do you think that is a challenge that can or will create unity or disunity as the world finds a way to come to grips with it? Or how do we find ways to effectively cooperate before the planet we live on is so ravaged that there's no point in living here, really? I smile when I say it, but it is not a humorous topic.
No, it's not. I mean, I don't have an answer about whether we can come to terms with it or not, to be honest. I think we have to start at home. And that means essentially that the United States really has to decide that the model on which we built our industrial society and our post-industrial society over the last 150 years is going to have to change quite radically. And it's going to have to do it fundamentally when we're talking about the way we produce our energy and consume it. Now, I don't have any real crystal ball here about whether America is ready to take the radically revolutionary changes that are going to be required to make the big difference. We may, we have done it in the past. We've done it, but this is like the invention of the steam engine, frankly. It's the same kind of change. This is simply going to demand that we live a different kind of life in many ways. And I don't know whether Americans are prepared to say we're ready. I hope my kids and my grandkids will, but I don't have a crystal ball. Now, I think the same is true when we then asked about the international implications, because even if the United States does all the right things, it won't solve the problem. This is going to have to be an effort that is global in nature, and in which we are going to have to ask countries like China, the Russian Federation, which is huge in its extent, many countries of the Southern Hemisphere that have far less wealth and well-being than we do, all to make sacrifices and to give up a kind of future that they thought they were building for themselves and take a very different direction. Now, I thought it was tremendously significant that President Obama was able to come to terms with China on this. If China is prepared to move in a constructive and positive direction, it seems to me that is a huge positive. I think it's clear Europe is prepared to do so. It's already probably ahead of most others. But the industrial world is going to have to come to terms with this question of whether people are really willing to sacrifice some of the way they live and the kind of day-to-day elements of their lives to make the changes that are necessary to have the change. And I don't know the answer to that. I do think if the United States demonstrates that we are willing and actively engaged in doing it, we will bring others along. I think that's quite possible. We've already shown it's possible to do that. But we're not going to do it unless we are prepared to bite the bullet ourselves.
Do you think there's economic opportunity in it? Job opportunities?
I think certainly there is. I mean, why the United States is not in the forefront of developing everything from battery technology to the latest gizmos that will allow us to live without burning fossil fuels is beyond me. I mean, we have done these kinds of things before, and the public has made great contributions to the sort of the research and backup that made it possible to do this. I mean, I read an article just recently, which really was terribly interesting to me, that in 2013, the idea of using the RNA part of us to deal with viruses was developed by the organization known as DARPA. Now, DARPA has invented all kinds of things in the past, and they put it out for research and development. Well, it's fine that the drug companies, Pfizer and some of the others, then produce the vaccine. But the idea of what is behind that vaccine and what made it possible was developed by public money in a public institution that basically thinks for a living. Now, we need a lot of those, and they are important to support, because if we don't have them, others are going to do it. And I mean, I think, we have every capability to do these things, but I am not convinced that we will do so. We're going to have to put the public money into it to do it. And if we do, then jobs are going to flow from all of this that never existed before. I mean, there are far more people, for instance, who have jobs today in the wind industry than in coal mining. We all know that. And yet people keep talking about the coal miners. Well, I mean, coal miners deserve a future. We're going to have to ease them out of what they do into something else that's dignified and a decent job. But we're not going to do it by refusing to give up coal. So, I mean, I think, the real question is, are we going to be prepared to put the government and the public's interest back to work in, if you will, resolving some of these issues? Because I frankly am not convinced that there's money in it short term, which is what the capitalist system rewards.
Well, you've posed a really interesting statement of dilemma and challenges for us. Christine, I'm going to make sure that we give an opportunity to make sure that audience questions that might be coming up are posed. So can I turn things over to you and give you that chance?
Absolutely. I'm sure there are several questions here that people are eager to hear about. Circling back to China, you mentioned they're a major player on the world stage now, and yet there seems to be a lot of negative reporting in the US press about China. What are the stakes for the US and China in their relationship? And what do you think that the bilateral relationship will look like in, say, 10 years from now, 2031?
Well, I think, we are going to be dealing with a China that is going to have tremendous economic power, that has a growing military capacity, and that is going to demand that its voice have a significant place in the shaping of the future global international system. I don't care whether it's economics, politics, security, so forth. And I think, for us, the question is, how are we going to manage our way in a world in which this new rising power is going to be asking for certain recognition, certain authority, certain capacity in a part of the world where after World War II, it was largely the United States that was dominant. And by that, I don't mean in the Chinese mainland and so forth. But if you look at, our view, I think, of that part of the world, it was that the Pacific Ocean was our ocean to, basically, it was our sea. We had driven out the only true competitor in it at the end of World War II. There was no one challenging us there. Even the Soviets didn't really challenge us in the Pacific. And so, suddenly in the 21st century, it is no longer the case that this is an arena in which we have it more or less to ourselves. And getting used to that is going to be difficult. I think there is probably no real answer to the question at the moment about how we're going to accommodate to having a partner that in some sense will have the same kind of authority and economic clout and economic, even military capacity regionally that we do. And so it's going to be a great diplomatic and political challenge to find what are the new rules of the game, what are the new arrangements that manage places where we come into conflict about our interests or our competition. And I think we're only at the beginning of opening up that discussion. For most of until I would say the 2000s, no one paid much attention to the rise of China. And suddenly, President Obama was the one who said, we really have to begin to think about Asia and the Pacific as a major issue on which we have to define a future and the capacity to deal with the new realities of a China that is going to be a true competitor. And so, we have a lot of work to do. We're not used to it. The idea that China is simply going to be doing what we say or what we tell them is just not going to be the case anymore, if it ever was.
So it seems like it will take a lot of brain power, a lot of different people working on this issue. We have a person attending today. His name is Jonathan Scanlon, and he was a civil service officer at the State Department. He thanks you for your service to our country, but he notes that many of his former colleagues left or were forced out of the State Department under the previous administration, and that he witnessed a decline in staffing levels amongst diplomats and civil servants. He understands that the Biden administration proposed adding new positions to rebuild our diplomatic corps. What do you think it will take to gain consensus in Congress to increase the hiring of the State Department?
Well, I'm not sure I have an answer to that. I think the Congress in the end will be supportive of the idea that you need a strong diplomatic corps and institution that can conduct an effective foreign policy. Now, what that'll mean in terms of positions and the mix of them and so forth, I'm not sure. And, this is an inside Washington problem that, I'm not sure I understand. But I don't think the issue, frankly, I don't think the main issue for the Department of State at this time is staffing. I personally believe that the real issue for the State Department at this time is that the American people have not got a consensus about where we're going or what our really important interests are, or how we should be pursuing them. I was fortunate enough to live through a period at from the height to the end of the Cold War and on to through the 90s, in which I would say there was a consensus. Americans knew what we were about. It was clear how the world was shaped, and even if there were some unreal elements to it, we basically had, I would say, a broad consensus, both in the Congress, in the executive, and broadly across the country about how the world was working. I think at this point, that's not true. And the absence of a sense about where America stands in the world, how we're going to conduct our affairs effectively in the future, and what we're about in doing so is very difficult for the State Department, because diplomats essentially need a context within which they're working. They need to have a sense for what the point is. What are they trying to do? And right now, I think the department has gone through very difficult times. I agree with that. But there were times, as much as anything, caused by the sort of divisions and uncertainties that we have in our society. And so I'm hoping that, we will be in a position, if Mr. Biden can begin the process of healing and pulling things together, that we will also do so in a way that gives the State Department a lot more authority and a lot more capacity. And I think that will do a great deal to, I would say, strengthen the future of the diplomatic service and the State Department. And I thank your colleague in the civil service for whatever he was doing too.
We have a question about changes taking place in the Middle East and the challenge presented by Iran's aggressive policies, and what your views might be on U.S. policy in the Middle East moving forward.
Well, again, I sort of felt fortunate that I left the government before the Middle East I knew sort of, I think, changed dramatically. When I was dealing with the Middle East, the critical issues were the Arab-Israeli conflict, and to a degree, Islamic extremism because of what had happened in Iran. But I think at this point, the United States approach in the Middle East is in many ways a bit at sea. It's not entirely clear what we're seeking to achieve or what our means are. The attack on 9/11 was a terrible shock. The United States had always had the luxury of thinking that things like that happened over there. In the Middle East, terrorism was sort of the kind of problem that beset those societies, and you had it in some other places, but it wasn't over here. And similarly, we were comfortable that we had the kind of relationships in the Middle East that had grown more or less out of the post-1973 structure of things that we're dealing with, the Arab-Israeli crisis and so forth. Once again, I think in the last 2 decades, that picture has changed dramatically. The upheavals that have come from the non-sovereign actors in the Middle East, that was hardly beginning when I left, has changed dramatically many of the dynamics in the region, and what we do about that is very complex. So you have, in many ways, the whole state structure in the Middle East up in question as to whether it's going to survive, like countries like Yemen or Syria. What's happening here? You also have the rise of Iran as a major power in the region. and exerting its authority in ways that have become more troubling as the instabilities in Syria, Iraq, and so forth have destabilized many of the nation states in the region. So, I mean, our own policy, it seems to me, is sort of in search of a goal, of an approach. Mr. Biden has decided that we are going to leave Afghanistan. Now, I happen personally to welcome that because I think 20 years is enough. But I think it's also the reality that it's hard for us to define what our objectives now are in the Middle East. I think we will stand by Israel. I mean, as a state, we will not let it fall. And we have relations that are quite solid with countries like Egypt and so. But the role we are willing to play in the Middle East, I think, is not really at the moment terribly well defined. And so I am not sure I have a good prescription for this. I mean, it seems to me we need to be sure that it is understood by all in the Middle East what we stand for, what we support, and then be pretty consistent about how we implement policies that are consistent with those values and those interests. I'm just not sure that we've been doing that terribly much effectively. I don't think that's a very good answer to the question, which is a good one and a tough one.
Well, I've got another toughie for you, and we have time for just about one or two more here. One is, what role would you like to see the media play on foreign relations? And conversely, what harm has been caused? Same thing about social media.
Well, the whole issue of the fact that everybody now is able to play in everybody else's business in both traditional media ways, newspapers, television, and so on, but also now everybody's got a computer. I mean, I've been told there are 240 million cell phones in Russia. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's about 2 for every citizen. I mean, so we're all part of one big information space now. And I think the issue of what that means and how we cope with it is one of the greatest challenges we now face, both at home here and more broadly. For instance, I know we've had great arguments in the United States about interference in our affairs or in our politics and social media being used. Well, there's nothing in our Constitution that says somebody living in, I don't know, Smolensk can't express a view on the internet about American policy. It just doesn't, it's not, it's a reality. Any more than we would say our citizens don't have a right to put on the internet something about how we think Mr. Navalny should be treated. So we have a problem, essentially. I mean, it is an open information space. So in a sense, controlling it is probably not an option. Now, we might come to terms, we might have some agreements between governments that governments would or would not engage in certain kinds of activities. That's possible. I don't think it's very likely, but it's possible. But I think the reality is that social media are here to stay. The only way we are ever going to deal with it, it seems to me, is to educate our public about what you pay attention to and what you don't. And also, to the extent possible, ensure that it is clear when things on social media are being sponsored by foreigners or people outside, and make sure that they know where information or views are coming from. Um, I don't see an answer to that, but I think the reality is that social media, or if you will, the universal information space, is certainly with the United States for any time in the foreseeable future. And whether or not the Chinese or the Russians or some of the others will be able to control it more remains to be seen. Right now, the Russians can't really do it, but who knows? But we better get used to the idea that voices from outside are going to be part of our discussion. And there's not much that we can or probably want to do about it.
Briefly, you mentioned Mr. Navalny. How important should his release be to our Russian-American relations?
Well, I think we have to be very clear what we stand for. We have to be very clear that, trying to poison a political opponent is not something we find acceptable in anyone we're going to work with as a partner or constructively as a friend. And so, I think having said that, we are not in control. And I must say, I am not a great fan of the idea that our Congress or our government can punish Russia into changing the way it does business. It hasn't worked in the past, and it probably won't work now. And we can make it cost. We can impose costs, yes, but we I think need to find out whether there's a way to begin to discuss things like human rights in a way that can bring some kinds of more constructive outcomes for issues where we truly disagree and where our values clash terribly bluntly. In the end of the Cold War, in the Gorbachev era, the United States had a regular dialogue with the Soviet leadership about human rights cases. And we haven't had that, it seems to me, with the Russian Federation for 20 years. And I think, this needs to be part of the agenda, and we need to be able to find a way to begin to discuss it and perhaps address some of the issues that divide us. But short of that, the idea that we can punish and compel Russia as a great power to do things our way, I think is just not realistic.
I think on that note, we're going to have to draw things to a close here. My gosh, there's so much more that we could be talking about, and so much more you have to share and we have to learn. But Christine, I'd like to thank you for bringing forth at least some of the questions that the audience has posed. Ambassador Collins, I want to tell you on behalf of the City Club how delighted we are that you would spend time with us here. I do know, because you've confided in me, that you have a summer home in California. And since it's really hot in California right now, I think you may want to just amble up north to Bellingham sometime and really enjoy cooler weather and spend some time with us. We'd love to have you here.